The setup. "You're just too picky, Julie," my best friend Carrie insisted. She was talking so loudly that I pulled the phone away from my ear. I was out doing some last-minute Christmas shopping, and Carrie's voice was overpowering, even Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer blasting over the speakers in the mall food court. Carrie gets loud when she gets worked up. For some reason, my non-existent love life has become unacceptable ever since she's gotten engaged. "I am not too picky," I protested. "I just haven't met the right one yet." "You'll never meet the right one until you forget that guy." "What was his name?" "That one who disappeared on you." "Went off to, where was it again?" Carrie did know his name, and she knew where he'd gone off to. She'd made me repeat the whole sad tale about 1,000 times. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. I did know what she was talking about. Carrie had this theory that I was still hung up on some boy I dated for a few months in high school. That was ridiculous. He was ancient history. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. I doubted if we met in the street, we'd even recognize each other. My lack of enthusiasm about meeting new men had nothing to do with some boy I imagined I was in love with way back in high school. Carrie was right about one thing. I was sure I remembered him as being sweeter and smarter and cuter than he actually had been. That's what nostalgia is, remembering things as being better than they actually were. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, didn't become an overused aphorism for nothing. Carrie sighed on the other end of the line as if I were a lost cause. I'm not a lost cause. I just have discriminating taste. I have to go, I told Carrie. I'm getting a text from my mother. Your grandmother is going to call you. Please pick up. That's how my mother always refers to my father's mother, your grandmother. Never Granny, or Grandma, or Halmiani, which is what my father taught us to refer to her as. Halmiani didn't come to Seattle to live next door to us until she was in her 70s. She left all her friends behind in Seoul, and although she'd made new ones and volunteered 5 days a week, she still seemed to have a lot of energy left for side projects. Getting me married off was her latest one. Ever since I'd turned 27, which was 2 years ago, my grandmother had become increasingly convinced that I was never going to find a husband on my own, and it was up to her to get me married off. I was not averse to getting married at the right time to the right man, but I didn't believe there was any chance of meeting the right man by getting fixed up on blind dates by my grandmother. Unfortunately, fixing me up with all the random single men her other 70-something friends suggested had turned into a major pastime with her. Those blind dates had never once not turned out to be an excruciating experience. It wasn't like I was holding out for a genius, or a millionaire, or someone who looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. I'd have settled for, in order of importance, kind, emotionally stable, kissable, and employed. I considered a man worthy of further consideration if he were simply civil, sane, seeking employment, and didn't have offensive body odor. So far, none of the men my grandmother and her friends had conspired to set me up with had fulfilled all 4 of even my entry-level criteria. I was forced to admit my hapless dates probably felt the same way about me. I had trouble being civil on these blind dates, let alone charming. It's hard to be civil when you'd rather be anywhere else, and I'm afraid it showed. I suspected the whole Halmiani Matchmakers network was doomed to a 100% failure rate, although there was a rumor that my grandmother's friend Mrs. Choi had successfully matched her podiatrist's daughter with the son of the man who did her taxes. I'd long ago concluded that the dismal success rate of my grandmother's network was down to a problem with the screening process. More often than not, these potential suitors suggested by my grandmother were not men she'd actually met in the flesh. Sometimes, her friends hadn't even met them. Sure, Halmiani had seen pictures and gotten the man's specs, as she called them, but photographs are notoriously deceiving, and the temptation of my grandmother's friends to exaggerate the bona fides of their next-door neighbor's postman's personal trainer or their favorite pharmacist's sister-in-law's nephew was too great to resist. The members of my grandmother's Korean Baptist Church Deaconess Squad had one overarching goal, pairing off all the Korean singletons in Greater Seattle with each other. Korean singletons were their main beneficiaries, or victims if you looked at it another way, but they didn't shrink from ensnaring any of the unattached who wandered haplessly into their web. There was a complete disregard for whether these singletons wanted to be paired off or not. It didn't matter if my grandmother and her friends were having a book club meeting or sorting cast-off clothing at the charity thrift store, they never left off trying to matchmake. Getting singles married off was, of course, simply the initial goal. The ultimate motivation was getting all those former singletons to produce great-grandbabies. As the list of my disastrous blind dates got longer, my grandmother had softened significantly on her previously stated goal of me finding a nice, educated Korean boy to settle down with. Currently, she'd modified her criteria to include any childless man between the ages of 27 and 37, Korean or not, who had a neat haircut and no visible tattoos. Tattoos and stepchildren had become the dual categorically disqualifying characteristics when it came to identifying husband material. Halmiani had become desperate. I was not. After never knowing when she was going to spring a new potential suitor on me and tiring of coming up with excuses why I couldn't possibly go on another excruciating date, I'd hammered out a compromise with my grandmother. I'd go out on a blind date the second Saturday afternoon of each month. That was it. I'd originally hoped that Halmiani wouldn't be able to find dates to fill my severely restricted window, but so far, for 3 months running, she'd not failed to fix me up with some poor guy who'd probably rather be anywhere else than sitting across from me while I sucked down a latte and replied to his questions in monosyllables. On a few occasions, the man in question had been so equally lacking in enthusiasm that we'd just sat there across from each other, nursing our drinks and scrolling through our phones until our allotted 60 minutes was up. This month, the second Saturday fell 3 days before Christmas. I'd tried to beg off, saying that no man would want to meet me so close to the holiday. They'd have better things to do. Halmiani had insisted on trying anyway. True to my mother's prediction, my phone rang. It was my grandmother. "I have a wonderful man for you to meet, Julie. He's Mrs. Young's hairdresser's nephew." She told me all about him while we were organizing the costumes for the children's church Christmas pageant. My grandmother said, "He's very high spec." Halmiani spoke with the kind of unbridled enthusiasm born either of desperation or pathological optimism. Since this was my grandmother we're talking about, it was probably a combination. High spec. 5 years ago, if my grandmother had described a man as high spec, it would have meant he was the CEO of something or at least a doctor. Now high spec simply meant my date was unlikely to try and talk me out of my spare change at the conclusion of the date or have parked all his earthly goods contained in a stolen shopping cart outside the cafe. "His name is James Radcliffe," my grandmother said. "He owns his own business, he's a volunteer fireman, he has 2 cats, and his hobby is collecting records." Given my grandmother's friend's propensity for massaging the truth, this Mr. Radcliffe's business probably involved selling used electronics with the serial numbers filed off. The volunteer fireman's statement could mean he indulged in serial arson on the side. The cats might easily turn out to be a couple of mangy, illegally procured tigers chained up in his basement, and the record collecting could be a polite way of disclosing that James was a repeat criminal offender. "Do you mean this James collects vinyl records?" I asked. "Like the ones that play music?" "Of course, what other kind of records are there?" "And these cats, what kind are they?" "How should I know?" Halmiani said. "Wait, I have a picture. I'll send it to you." "Never mind," I said. "I don't want to see a picture." "But your date asked me to send you the picture," my grandmother insisted. "A picture of him and his cats? What a weirdo." "Yes. I don't need to see a photograph," I insisted. "I've got a clear picture of this James Radcliffe already." "Be at the usual place," Halmiani told me. 2 o'clock and wear a dress." "I'll be there at 2 o'clock, I said. I didn't promise to wear a dress. "I have a good feeling about this one," my grandmother insisted, then gratuitously admonished me not to forget to put on makeup. Halmiani always has a good feeling about this one. She's never once been right.